Hello, everyone. My name is Raj Gupta, and I'm an anesthesiologist down at in Nashville, Tennessee. And I was coming live today mainly because it's been I was doing some live streams last year when the pandemic started, and it's been about a year. It was a way for me to kind of deal with being stuck at home all the time and feeling disconnected from a community of people that were colleagues that I worked with and people who were doing important things around the country. It was also a way to deal with a lot of the uncertainty going on in the world as we were learning about COVID and what it meant for our friends, our family, but at that time, even what it meant for us as healthcare providers and what we were doing in the hospital, taking care of patients, how we were keeping ourselves safe. We were learning from each other. The information was coming to us fast and in all kinds of disjointed forms. And so we were learning from each other, sharing with each other. And in that process, I was able to connect with a community of people all over the world who are going through a similar experience as all of us have for this last year now, but making something constructive out of it instead of just feeling like we were wallowing in the suffering of isolation, challenging medical care, personal risk, family risk, patient risk, and all those things associated with that. So there were many people I talked to when I was doing these live streams. I was doing a couple of weeks, sometimes more than that, sometimes every day, because I felt like I was at home and not able to do other kinds of productive things. And there were regulars. We had people talking to me from all over the world and joining me in this conversation. So as I kind of wax poetic about what my year has been on this, I invite those of you who are interested and who are watching to join me on this conversation. There's a link in the comments field, and I can also, let me see if I can make a little banner on the bottom of the screen that lets you join in with the video chat here and actually join me in this conversation. I'd love to have you talk to me and tell me what your perspective is, what you've been doing over this last year and how you've been coping, how things have evolved since March and April of last year when we started all of this havoc all over the world, and then where you guys see the next few months going. I'll share my thoughts on those while we're waiting on people to join us, and then tell me what you think as well, because I think we've had a lot of time to process information and gain a lot of insight. So this is the link, StreamYard.com, and then it's got a couple of letters after it. Like I said, it's in the comments if you want to just copy the link itself. And if you don't really want to jump on, feel free to put a comment in the comment field. I'll post it up on the screen and discuss that as well. But I'm always interested in hearing what people's opinions are and their perspectives. So for me, this year has been a weird mix of a lot of different emotions, a lot of different challenges, and surprisingly some new successes and accomplishments as well. And so it's difficult to sum up the year in one direction. I think early on there was a lot of frustration, a lot of anger. We obviously were seeing information be a big problem in the pandemic. We were getting information that was useful. We were getting information that was premature. I think in the scientific community, we struggled with this as well. There were a lot of eager people providing information and ideas and suggestions about medications, about treatment, about ways to keep ourselves safe. And they were all theoretical. We had no science, we had no evidence. We were just doing our best to figure things out, especially when we didn't have things like proper PPE, masks, eye shields, gloves, even at times. And so those were challenging times. I'll tell you a story about one of my rabbit holes that I chased down. So early on, if you guys remember, so I'm an anesthesiologist, and one of our biggest fears was intubating people, and what that does as far as projecting COVID particles, air particles, aerosol particles into our face when we don't have proper protection, didn't have proper N95 masks and stuff. Even face shields were hard to come by at that time. Side note, we were actually making some at home. We were taking, we had a friend of ours kind of come up with a technique for making home face shields, and we used plastic dividers from like folders and some foam, the foam, like a weather stripping foam, which actually was hard to come by as well. We had to look around a few places to find some weather stripping foam, black duct tape, and staples. And, we had our kids in our dining room, doing an assembly line of these face shields with all these plastic, and we donated them to our hospital so that people would have access to face shields when we didn't have enough. We couldn't find enough. But anyway, so one of the big fears we had was intubations and aerosolization coming during the intubation. And one of the things that came out of China was this intubation box. Neat idea, simple idea. It was a plexiglass cut into a square, and it had a couple of holes cut out of it to put over the patient's head, and then you would intubate through that, theoretically reducing the spray back towards you and reducing your exposure risk. And this was intended to be used in the ICU, in the operating room, anytime you wanted to get somebody intubated. Well, I was enthralled by this. Many people were enthralled by this. It seemed like a simple solution to a problem that we were all facing. And so I kind of went about figuring out if I could get that implemented at our hospital. Had to do a lot of digging, started reaching out to friends and family, looked for people who worked in those kinds of plastics, found companies in Texas, here in Tennessee, all over that were willing to help me. They were out of business. They were just looking to, do something to help the medical providers, and they weren't manufacturing their normal goods. So they were interested in doing something that they could find a solution for that might turn into a business for them, but if nothing else, at least help people. And so, I worked with an engineer designer in Texas, and he designed a box for me, figured out how it would go together, built a few prototypes. He actually shipped them by crate from Texas to Tennessee. We bought like 5 of them. It turned out that they were there. and we had them available, but they were cumbersome, and we started getting new information that um, they probably weren't as good as we thought they were. They didn't work as well as we thought they would, and so we did some testing, and other people had done some testing. We saw that aerosols kind of fly out the holes of this thing and leak out the armholes, leak out the bottom towards the body of the patient, and end up all over the room anyway if somebody coughed or something like that during intubation. So they were cumbersome and irritating, and then probably not as helpful as we thought. So I was like, well, can we build a better box? And so I started going about trying to figure out how to build a better box, and actually worked with our engineering department at my institution. And we started looking at solutions to seal the box off. How do we seal it off along the body of the patient? I started working with some other people looking at solutions for suctioning out of the box and seeing if we could filter the suctioning from the box so that any aerosolized material that was inside the plastic box was evacuated quickly before we remove the box off the patient's head. Try to figure out ways to seal things around the armholes. And so we actually looked at the systems where lab hoods have gloves that are integrated into the plastic, into the shield. And so you put your arms into a hood, but you're still isolated from the internal environment. We actually bought some of those gloves and actually built a prototype. I still have it. I looked at cheaper solutions using magnets and surgical gowns, and actually did a simulation and did some testing. I have some videos that are kind of interesting about testing these with a little smoke machine to kind of simulate aerosols and vacuum and arm sleeves and all this kind of stuff. It was fun. It was a neat, interesting experiment. Didn't really end up using it because by the time I figured all this stuff out, we saw that it probably wasn't as good as we'd hoped, and it was. We've got more PPE at that point, and N95s and face shields were more ergonomic and probably just as effective at protecting us as long as we had the right people in the room. And then if you could get into a room that had better ventilation, that was even better. So that took up, I was kind of like revved up in March and April of last year. Like many of us, our brains were going into overdrive. We were revved up looking for solutions to problems that we saw all around us. And so we, explored. I remember talking to a colleague out in San Diego who I just met online. I didn't know her beforehand, but she was working with a group where they were trying to build a small, inexpensive ventilator. Remember when ventilators were extremely short supply, and we didn't know if we would have enough with the estimated numbers that were coming out. And so there were a lot of groups working on portable, easy to use, small ventilators that could be assembled without big manufacturing equipment. And they had some success with that, and they did some testing. I don't know what they ended up doing with that project long term, but it was exciting to see people collaborating and enthusiastic and sharing information like that. And it makes me wonder, like, what if we put our minds to problems like that, what other things could we solve? Anybody who's joining, by the way, if you're starting to listen now, if you want to jump in on the conversation, there's a link that says StreamYard.com, and it's got a few letters at the bottom of the screen here, but also in the comments. If you want to jump on the video and talk, or just put something up in the comments, I'd love to chat with somebody and see how they're doing. So anyway, that was kind of early times. We were not doing very many cases at first in the operating rooms. We were learning and discussing and talking and reading at home. We were trying to find solutions to our problems around us, but it was a lot of unknowns. We didn't know where the pandemic was going. And now when we look back at that time, the numbers were extremely small relative to what we've seen now. There was just a lot of unknowns. And then, of course, there were pockets of places. New York was hit really hard. Seattle, Washington was hit really hard in the United States. There were a few pockets around the country that were experiencing spikes. I remember some people in the Bay Area in California were seeing some spikes. And so those places were getting really high numbers in a very short amount of time with no preparation and no safety precautions, no protections. I know our institution was ramping up. We were expecting influx, but Nashville and the Tennessee area received patients later. We didn't get as many early on. And so we had enough lead time to prepare our hospital, prepare our staffing, um, create space, create equipment, gather supplies, and then focus a lot of our efforts in a couple of places so that we could redirect testing, we could redirect patient care into isolated areas so that the rest of the hospital didn't feel the full ramifications of the pandemic, of the COVID. And so we could actually sort of have one set of the hospital functioning like normal, relatively normal, and then the isolated part that was dealing with the COVID. The downside to that was that, there were some parts of our faculty that felt the brunt, our hospital, our staff, that felt the brunt of the COVID experience early on, and did so quite through a lot of the year. And I think that's probably true in a lot of places, that as we got better at isolating the COVID patients, we probably burdened a smaller portion of our institutions with the COVID problem. The year got messier, worse. I think there was a lot of frustration from medical professionals looking at other people who weren't taking the problem seriously and then creating problems for us in healthcare to take care of the sick patients. As we saw people who felt like they could go about their daily lives like normal, because maybe the rules didn't apply to them, maybe they didn't fully understand, maybe they didn't believe it was such a big deal. And then the ripple effects would hit us in the hospital, hit us in our communities, hit us with our patients. And for some of us, hit us with our families and friends too. It was a frustrating time. I know this year has been quite the dilemma. It's been frustrating for our kids. I have a high schooler and a middle school child, and we took them out of their regular school. We actually ended up putting them in an online school, and it's hard. It's frustrating. They're lonely. They miss their friends. They miss their school. Some of their friends have gone to returned to in-person school, but we don't feel comfortable with that yet in our community. And so it's been a tough year for them in isolation. At the same time, they've probably learned some skills that they didn't realize that they needed to learn. Organizational, self-motivation, self-direction. Some of those things they probably don't even realize will benefit them until much later when they compare it to people who maybe didn't have to do all that stuff on their own. I think our two kids have gotten a lot closer. They've bonded with each other, and learned to adapt and work around each other. And I think that's been probably a really good thing. If I look back at what their school year would have been like, I bet we probably saw a lot more of them this year than we would have in a normal school year. So I can't complain about that either. And I think that's been a positive take on what's happened this year. But now things have gotten closer to normal. With all the vaccines going around, at least in the healthcare environment, most of the people that I work with are vaccinated. A lot of our patients are coming in vaccinated. Testing is easier to acquire and more consistent. Masking is mostly pretty good, although in some places we still see some failures. And after the winter spikes, the terrible spikes we had in the winter, December, January, after the holidays, when people were gathering and much more casual about social distancing and masking and things like that. And we saw that ramification in January. We're seeing numbers still going down. So, and in our hospital environment, we're seeing testing of patients being positive going down. We're seeing testing of our staff remarkably down. And I think that's exciting. And we see a future horizon where things may be getting better at some point. I don't know if you guys are seeing that in your community yet. I'd love to hear from you if you're seeing things in your community get better, if you're seeing things in your community stabilize out, less people getting sick, more people able to do what they need to do. and businesses starting to open, but in a safe way. I'm excited about what happens this summer. I'm excited about what happens in the fall. Kids going back to a mostly normal school year in the fall. Work getting back to normal. This spring, I'm in May. I'm going to my first medical conference for American Society of Regional Anesthesia, and I'm going to go to Orlando for that. And I feel confident that we can do that safely. So it feels like finally, after a year, we're starting to turn things around. Hard to believe it's taken that long, and in some ways, hard to believe it's been so quick. That after something so dramatic, things can actually get better in such a short time. And so, I reflect back on the year because I think this is going to be a year to remember. Again, for people being creative, connecting in ways that we normally wouldn't do. Our busy lives, our day-to-day lives are often so crammed with stuff we don't have time to reach out to people outside of our small circle. And so I feel like that's been an interesting change this year. And but we can't forget the challenges that people went through. Some places more than others, some people more than others. Personally, we've lost family this year, and relatives, some to COVID, some sort of COVID related, some sick in the hospital that, the COVID pandemic just made being with them that much more challenging. And that's not going to be forgotten. And I think I always look for something good to come out of bad things. And I'm hoping that we can find the goodness out of this last year. I'm hoping we can find a renewed interest in being together, a renewed interest in living experiences, and a renewed interest in sharing and collaborating. I hope that we learned from this year that we can't isolate ourselves. We depend on each other. We count on each other. And those are going to be important traits as we move into our future. So I've been chatting for about 25 minutes. Maybe I picked a bad time of day. I don't know if anybody's been able to join. I may try to pick a different time of day, another day this week, and see if we can get some people to join in. But like I said, I'll stay on for a couple more minutes. If you guys have any comments or questions, if you want to just chime in or jump on and let me know how things have been in your neck of the woods, I would love to hear from you. I think that it's important that we share these experiences because I think everybody's gone through it a little differently. There's a lot of regional differences, differences in urban and rural environments, differences in medical professions, and how people approach the problem. So if you have some thoughts on that, I'd love to hear from you. And, one of the other interesting things that have come out of this year, one of my experiences, is that I've had a chance to talk to people that I normally wouldn't have ever encountered that have still sustained and been connected over this year. People from, we met somebody from Israel, somebody from Algeria, from Europe. We had a conversation with someone from Singapore, and then obviously all over the United States, people in different parts of the specialty of anesthesia. I usually talk to people in acute pain regional anesthesia, but we talk to different people in different parts of anesthesia. And I think people were craving the conversation, craving the sharing. And so it was a great opportunity to highlight their experiences and their insight in a forum that was probably a little different than most of us are used to. One of the other interesting things this last year has brought is I kind of built this home studio setup, little bit by little bit. I've been working on microphones, set up for StreamYard, audio inputs, a light. I've got a ring light up here to do some better lighting. I got a new camera that allows me to feed high quality video into this and a connector to connect that back into the computer. lot of learning this year about how all of this stuff goes together. And we do a podcast for Azra called Azra Rap that we're starting to use this platform to broadcast the podcast, record it, and then also publish it in audio format. So that's kind of neat to have this new platform to push out information. We've even so much so that another subsidiary part of Azra, the Azra News Group, is starting to use the same platform to do a different version of the podcast, so that we've got two different podcast streams coming using the same technology, which is pretty cool. So anyway, well, those are a couple of my thoughts from this last year. I hope some of you guys have a chance to watch this when you're free, and tell me what would be a good time. I'd love to talk to some more people, catch up with them. Maybe I'll try over the weekend sometime and see if those are better times, because now that everybody's back to mostly going back to work, I don't think everybody has as much free time as they used to jump on these calls. But it's been a pleasure doing these live streams over this last year, and I've learned a lot and met a lot of people, and hopefully we'll be able to do some more in the future, maybe not as regularly as we were before, and continue the conversation, because I think that we still have a lot to learn from each other, not just about the pandemic, but about how we care for our people, how we care for ourselves, and what we can learn moving forward. Thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure, and I'll talk to you some more in the near future. Take care.